Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. Today's episode is a really wonderful conversation with Abbott Miller. Abbott, of course, is a partner at Pentagram, where he leads a variety of exhibition and publishing projects. But Abbott is also a really good writer and has published essays in publications like I and Print and ID Magazine. One of the reasons I was really interested in talking to Abbott is because, on a sort of surface level, it would seem like Abbott had left the writing side of his career, and we talk about this in our conversation. But what's interesting to me is that as a college student, Abbott and his now wife, Ellen Lupton, used writing and criticism and theory as a way to, as Abbott told me, quote, fight the banality of graphic design. And it's not that he's not interested in this now or that he's not writing now, but it's that he's found a way in his work at Pentagram to truly seamlessly connect these interests in design and research and writing and theory. And it all manifests itself in the actual design work that he does. And this is something that I obviously find really inspiring and interesting, and is really what this podcast is all about. And so we kind of pick that apart a little bit in what I think is a really interesting way. We also talk a lot about how he started writing in his early career, how exhibition design brings together all of his interests, and we talk about the writers and designers who have really meant the most to him and influenced how he thinks about all of this. I've gotten to know Abbott a bit over the last few years while I was studying here at MICA in Baltimore, and really enjoyed this conversation and learning more about his background and how he thinks about this relationship between design and writing. And I think it's something that you'll enjoy as much as I did. So here is my conversation with Abbott Miller. I kind of wanted to start. I was thinking about the things that I wanted to talk to you about, and I was thinking about your career trajectory. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of wanted to start filling in some of the gaps in that I haven't been able to piece together. Sure. So I know that you went to Cooper Union and studied graphic design.
Well, at Cooper, there was sort of famously never a sort of single track for graphic designers.
Okay.
So at Cooper, there was a lot of promiscuity between the different sort of avenues that you might take. And only one of them was really, there were courses in graphic design and typography.
Right. Okay.
But a lot of people took them, including artists who really had no interest in becoming professional graphic designers. So it was really more like a medium or a tool. Okay. And so, a lot of people would graduate with a degree in, it was just a BFA.
Yeah. Okay.
But some of them would have a very strongly graphic design oriented BFA.
Yeah.
Others would be printmaking and graphic design. Others would be film, and some just pure art.
Right. So, that's kind of what I was curious about, is because I had read somewhere that you were interested in sculpture or some more fine art.
Yeah. I really went back and forth in my time at Cooper. I kind of entered thinking I was going to really be sort of focused on art. Okay. And then, that was from having already decided as in high school that I was going to be a graphic designer. Oh. So I kind of went through this sort of flip-flop. Yeah. And then it was film, and then it was back to sculpture, then it was back to graphic design. Okay. But nobody cared. Right. Because you're just taking courses, and although your personal identity is constantly like shifting and, there are great stakes in your personal definition.
Right. Okay, so this is interesting. This throws off some of the gaps that I was trying to fill in, because I had thought that you went in thinking fine art, sculpture, and then kind of discovered graphic design. But you knew before that was something you were interested in?
Yeah, I'd done like a summer session at Parsons. Oh, okay. When I was in high school, and that's how I found out about Cooper, because from the vantage point of Indiana, there was very little awareness of schools in New York City. So I'd never heard of Cooper. Okay. And then I found out about it. Everybody was talking about applying. And I felt like, when I was taking this course in graphic design at Parsons, that was actually really very conceptual, had a great teacher. It seemed to like click for me that like graphic design was serious and interesting. But as I got into Cooper, I kind of thought that this isn't enough.
What was it about graphic design at that young age that grabbed you?
I mean, part of it was feeling like that I had a kind of responsibility to myself and to my parents to actually have a viable, like a career. And it felt sort of like crazy indulgent to go to New York to study sculpture. At the time I just felt like, God, I got to get something like out of this. And it's sort of interesting and sort of sweet to imagine myself thinking that was the responsible choice at that time. But I did think about it that way. And yet it was also like, even in middle school, I was doing logos and kind of things that were really graphic design. So it wasn't an alien thing to me. And it was interesting too. It wasn't just pragmatic.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's very similar to actually my own background. I, as a kid, would make logos and would go to like grocery stores.
Mm-hmm.
My mom would take me to grocery stores, and I would then come home and try to recreate all the signs that I saw there, and had no idea that was a thing until 15 years later or something. Like that.
And I remember doing basically display lettering. Was like a big kind of preoccupation.
Interesting.
That lettering was as interesting to me to illustrate as drawing houses or anything.
Right. So when you're in school now and you're taking kind of all these classes and all these different fields, how are those talking to each other, or how?
They weren't. I mean, largely they weren't. I feel like the graphic design program at Cooper at that time was pretty conceptual and really strongly rooted in typography.
Okay.
So in terms of the rest of how design might have been taught in other schools, it was pretty conceptual, pretty arty.
Oh, interesting.
There's a famous class at that for a long period there called The Art of the Book. And it was basically artist books, but with good type. And so for me, it was still a different island than what was happening in the film classes or in the painting classes. Or I took a lot of courses with a political, sort of grandfather political art, Hans Hacke.
Oh, yeah.
And there was violent disagreement between a lot of the professors, and you had this sense of people kind of almost vying for your soul, like almost kind of pulling you in their direction.
Yeah.
It was pretty exciting because it was sort of like, it was a bit of a war.
Yeah. So did you have to decide while you were there that graphic design was kind of the...
You didn't, except that to advance and to do more sophisticated courses, you had to do the prerequisites.
Okay. Yeah.
But nobody was waiting for you to sign off. It was more just like you had this feeling of, this crazy, fantastic professor named George Sadek. You had this sense of him feeling like you had betrayed him by, not taking that class and instead doing the class in Hans's class. And
interesting. So I'm curious where the kind of, let me step back, and I'm projecting a little bit onto what I think of you and what I think of your career.
Yeah.
But you appear to have a deep interest in kind of the theoretical side of design also, and a lot of your work is kind of very rooted in critical theory.
Yeah.
I'm curious where that found its way into.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when we were at Cooper, we were, in one small building right next to the architecture program. I mean, the architecture program was like on the third floor. And they had this incredible, it was like a hothouse of theory, history, and such a deep history for architecture. And I remember feeling kind of jealous. It was like, well, we have art history classes, but they're not really connected to design, which they weren't. But look at the architects are having these explosive, confrontations in their critiques. They're having, Jacques Derrida come and talk to the students, Peter Eisenman. And it was sort of this funny thing, like, we've got to have some theory too. So really we meaning me and Ellen, started to really look at like, well, what are the other ways in which you could connect what was happening in theory to graphic design? And we started to think like this is actually a lot closer to graphic design than it is to architecture. I think there was a famous show, I forget where this is in the big trajectory, but there was a show on deconstructivist architecture at MoMA. And really a lot of the sort of deconstructivist thinking was really rooted in a lot of pure language, but also typography and kind of graphics. And so it seemed like that was sort of a way to almost hitch graphic design to those other things going on.
This is so interesting to me. I have a couple of questions kind of based on that. What was it? My first question is kind of what was it about seeing those architects or those architecture students talking about this that you were so attracted to? And did you have any interest in that before, or was it kind of just you were close and you were seeing it?
I think it was the vitality of it, that it was sort of a, you could argue a sort of practical pursuit of study, but that there was this bigger implications all around it. And so there was a attraction to that idea of a richer, deeper kind of context to work in, and a fear almost of what you could call the banality of graphic design, like, it's just graphic design. And, at this point now in my career, I don't think of it that way at all. And I think actually the field has changed dramatically. So, but at that time, there was a little bit of a sense like, well, will this be interesting enough? Because it was so maligned.
The graphic design
was sort of so maligned by the kind of people who would look askance at it and belittle it, even within Cooper. It was sort of like, the graphic design could be portrayed as they're selling out, or it's boring, or it's just for clients, or whatever the rap was. It felt like that was almost the threat. And yet we kind of felt like there's much more to it. Like this is language, this is typography. These are ideas. They're incredible traditions, like the history of the book. So it felt unfair to actually say that it was just commercial.
Right. And was it, I don't know how to phrase this without it kind of sounding weird, but was it kind of just basically you and kind of finding and discovering this? Was there a general sense among your classmates?
I think that there was a certain point where it felt like, indeed, we were talking to each other.
Okay.
Very much. But there were really smart people in our class as well. It's just that idea of an almost academic relationship to the topic was sort of unique to us. Ellen's sister was, studied literary criticism at Johns Hopkins and then at Yale. Oh, okay. She was kind of a conduit for us as well.
That makes sense.
And so it wasn't like it was going around in our circle. It was more like the two of us kind of trying to build this up. We also had amazing humanities professors at Cooper. One was a brilliant film theory guy named P. Adam Sitney, who had done a really influential book on experimental film. I had Robert Breer as a film teacher. And film theory was actually this whole other thing that was like completely related to graphic design and the idea of kind of film as a language. So we got excited from all these angles. And, the political people in the school were basically using the tools of graphic design to critique corporate design or corporate communications and big business. So it was sort of, there were all these facets going on that made it clear that one could build a kind of interesting intersection between the professional kind of definition of graphic design and the sort of intellectual traditions that it could annex.
Right. So, I mean, I don't mean to date you or put a date on this, but something that's always been interesting to me is how kind of in graphic design history, in the kind of mid-90s, there was this big kind of explosion of this type of discussion.
Right.
I'm trying to kind of situate kind of your discoveries in that.
I'm terrible with time, and that whole period is really sort of a blur. But it was happening all through there, and there were these different kind of camps that were interested in theory, interested in developing kind of even just the discourse around graphic design history.
Yeah.
So Steve Heller was actually editing the AIGA Journal of Graphic Design and was really influential just in inviting me to write something. Suddenly saying like, okay, do you want to write something? And he also did the Modernism and Eclecticism conferences, which suddenly there was like, oh, there's a forum for writing and presenting on mostly on design history, but it could easily, veer over into doing more critical writing. I did a piece for one of those conferences on stock photography, which was not so much history as a kind of analysis of the way stock photography is structured.
So this was my next question. I was curious kind of where you started writing, or how did that kind of how that started.
Right there. Okay. Because I was really, of course, doing writing in school, but then after school, I was working for Richard Saul Wurman.
Oh, yeah.
Who was the publisher of a series of guidebooks. And I decided to work for Richard because I was on one of my anti-design phases directly after graduating from Cooper. And Ricky was just then moving to New York. And I thought, like,
I didn't know you worked.
For about 4 years.
I did not know that.
He was provocative. He came to Cooper, and he was very, looking back, it was sort of like almost a sort of in your face, kind of refutation of the niceties of what graphic designers get wrapped up in. Very outside the sort of good design, not good, but just sort of.
Yeah, the classic.
He wasn't interested. He wasn't Rudy de Herrick. He wasn't M and Company. He was this guy who had an interesting premise about, structuring guidebooks by, how a street is arranged and what you have, what you see on a walk.
Yeah.
And I just was attracted to almost the anti-position. So I worked with him as a design job. It wasn't really all that satisfying because it was highly formatted. But I worked on this crazy book for the Museum of Modern Art that was published by him, which I later learned there was a reason it never came out. It was because all the curators had banded together to block it from ever seeing the light of day.
Oh, wow.
And as you can imagine, like the idea of a guidebook to the Museum of Modern Art put together by Ricky Wurman.
Yeah.
They weren't having it.
Yeah.
And so we're sort of stupidly working behind the scenes. Like, why are these meetings just continuing to happen and we never get to actually, like, no one will respond.
Right.
But I did that for a while, worked on a couple of projects. And then I started writing actually for Ricky, developing book proposals and some of his talks, and it was quite interesting because I was sort of like this sort of person who was doing some design but also doing some writing, and that and then working sort of with some of these opportunities, beginning to write for Steve Heller, starting to do these talks, starting to teach design history at Parsons, and then it was building into like sort of an interesting way to actually start entering the field of writing about design. And then I entered a art history program at City University.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
Yeah, and it was a PhD program in art history. They were totally up for having me focus on graphic design. That wasn't the issue. And I did probably 2.5 years of coursework. And I was running my studio, and I suddenly was just intense. Like, I can't do this all very well.
Right.
And meanwhile, we were actually doing like the writing and the research and the interesting projects and I realized like I'm not really gonna be like, I don't really necessarily see myself teaching the history of design or design theory professionally. And I kind of just left the program.
Yeah. Okay.
Major disappointment to them, I think.
Yeah, that's intense.
Yeah.
I did not know that whole.
Yeah, well, Ellen was in the same program.
I didn't know that. So there's this whole like.
There's a chapter in New York that's sort of like, yes.
That you
slice, yes.
So this sets up a couple of, basically a lot of the things that I was kind of interested in talking to you about. Had you done much writing, kind of outside of school papers and things before that?
No.
Or how did that,
No.
kind of how were you feeling about that? And did it come easy?
No, it never came easy. It still doesn't come easy. I think I'm much more sort of fluid in terms of design. I was always more comfortable in the seat of the designer than the writer.
Okay.
I have a kind of I'm totally committed and interested in writing, but it's not a happy event.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think any writer would really say, "Oh, I'm really happy when I write."
I know exactly what you mean.
It's more painful. Ellen is, it's just like, I'm not saying that it's not difficult, but it's fluid for her.
Yeah.
She can take a little, 20-minute episode and, go through things, and I'm still sort of sharpening my pencils.
Right.
But I love it, and there's probably nothing more satisfying than actually, feeling like you managed to articulate something.
Yeah.
But I'm a funny writer. Like, I have a lot of sort of verbal tics in my writing, and so I write, and then I have to really go back and look at it and really critically and kind of like try to get out the verbal, the speechy parts.
So that this is funny because I wanted to ask you about kind of, I'm going to skip around a little bit of the order that I was thinking. I wanted to ask you kind of about when you're talking about kind of verbal tics, the thing. I agree with you 100% about writing design is where I'm comfortable, but I'm very committed to, being able to call myself a writer, basically. But the thing that I feel like I struggle with a lot is, what is my writerly voice?
Mm-hmm.
And it's those same things where I feel like I have these certain tics and these certain turns of phrase that I use. And then there's other times where it's like, well, this just sounds like anybody could have written this, and kind of finding that balance to me is one of the hardest parts.
Right.
How did you kind of think about that when you were?
I don't know if I've really. I don't feel like I write enough that I have to really be so conscious of what my voice as a writer is.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about design writing research in that period, because that's something that's very interesting to me, and I obviously know the book,
right?
But that also was a studio.
Yeah.
Which one of those came first?
Well, the studio really. It's hard to exactly say the studio came first, but Ellen was working at Cooper Union with this Lubalin study center, this archive. So her first job out of school was as a curator of a graphic design collection. At that time, no one really understood what being a curator was. It's sort of everybody curates now. But at that time, it was pretty exotic. And so she was doing that work, which was sort of a dream job for her, really.
Oh, okay.
I was working with Ricky Werman.
Okay.
And I think her job seemed to be the more satisfying, exotic one. But we started kind of collaborating on external projects, basically freelance work, that would give us opportunities to do our interesting versions of what graphic design could be, which were often, very, very small, very esoteric, very kind of usually more academic. Yeah. We designed an issue of Visible Language, the journal, together. Yeah. We did posters for literary theory conferences at Yale. We worked for something up at Columbia. So they were these kind of, looking back on them, kind of very thoughtful and visually pretty dry, usually. Kind of like forging what we thought of as kind of an experimental approach to graphic design. Yeah. Very literary, very conceptual.
And this was very conscious? Like, this is the type of practice you were setting out to do?
Okay. Yeah, we really sought out those things. And they were the kinds of things that you wouldn't take to, a normal design studio. And they were, fairly marginal in terms of impact. But we started to develop these kinds of projects, and we decided to give that project a title. Like, it was a freestanding studio called Design Writing Research. We used it as a credit on several projects. And then...
Oh, like Design Writing Research by...
Well, it was like a name. It was like a band.
Right.
Design Writing Research was the band. We were the performers. I see. And that became, like, after working with Richard, I got a kind of retainer fee from the New Museum for a year. And once I got that, I'd been working doing small projects with art galleries. Once I got this retainer, which was like no money at all, but it was a promise of what I could live on. I thought, like, okay, I'm gonna really open my own studio now out of my apartment. And I did, and it was called Design Writing Research. As soon as I did that, like, the sort of like project materialized, and suddenly I hired someone. Then I got a space outside of my apartment. Then I had 3 or 4 people working with me, and it's kind of been that way ever since. Like, I have a pretty small team at Pentagram, and it really, in many ways, it's like there's a certain sort of number of people and projects that I feel comfortable with. And so it's really been kind of a funny trajectory of starting small and kind of staying small.
I don't mean to be too reductive here, but I'm curious about that name, Design Writing Research, and the fact that you have those 3 words, and those were the name that was like that umbrella. Which to me says a certain importance to the writing and the research that oftentimes designers, just, that's a blanket statement, but maybe don't take as seriously. What was your kind of thinking about the writing and the research, and how is that playing into the work you were doing now as a studio with clients?
Well, I think when we chose that sequence, it was sort of about putting design at the beginning, that design could actually drive writing and research, which was a little bit like of an inversion of the typical thought might be that somebody does some research, and then it turns into writing, and then it turns into design. And the design as kind of like a final frosting on the cake. We were sort of saying, well, what if you thought about design as actually driving those things? And it, whoever thought about it enough to appreciate it, that was the idea. Was also just that it was almost like a reductive process name for the studio. So I think that sort of, it summed up what we thought. It was trying to be a bit of a manifesto name. And it was dry and kind of geeky.
I'm so embarrassed that I've never thought about the order, and as soon as you said it, I was like, oh,
well, that was so sort of like that's where our kind of, that's why we sort of thought about the idea that if you started, that design is actually a sort of sense-making thing that could live in the driver's seat and actually may for a lot of people, in terms of framing a project. And and I think it was just this idea that, please don't tell us that design is really just like waiting for other people to author things. Coming to designers just to do that last bit of presentation.
I mean, I actually had written down, I'm going to be that person that reads back something that you had written. I think this is in your design and content book, actually, but you say that design is not a passive presentation of already cooked and digested ideas, but a critical tool capable of creating its own insights. And I mean, those are your words, but I feel like that really is a framework for your entire career in a lot of ways, that kind of sentence.
And I mean, I think a lot of the things that I was drawn to in early writing were examples of, other designers, other projects, other areas where you kind of had the sense that someone was starting from sort of design insights.
Yeah.
And, an example that just comes to mind is like, there's an incredible book by Irving Goffman on gender advertising. And it's basically a collage of basically contemporary media. I forget the year it was published, but it's a kind of catalog of poses. And this is an anthropologist who's sort of like looking at the visual production of American culture and finding within it this sort of inventory of poses. And to me, that was like a really interesting example of, he's looking at design as an artifact and then drawing conclusions from that research.
Right.
That's just I don't know why it came to mind, but
that's really interesting, though.
The idea that design is that, is capable of framing a project like that. Really interesting to me.
I'm curious how things like that and how kind of building a practice as a designer and someone who's writing, how those influenced each other. How did being a designer who was writing a text kind of change how you thought about writing a text, or then vice versa? Someone who could write an essay, was that changing how your design process or how it manifested itself?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a couple of contradictory things. Okay. One is that when I was actually truly doing the research and the research and writing on a lot of these projects, the appetite for like doing something really radical visually was sort of always a frustration. Actually, as a designer of my own content, I was not necessarily more adventurous. And actually, when I was in the role solely as a designer, I actually felt a lot freer formally. And a classic for me is when I was given a bunch of pictures to do a magazine about dance, I suddenly felt like, okay, like it was sort of thrilling not to be so kind of connected to the content, but actually to almost feel like I'm here to perform with images and text. And it was sort of an interesting realization that you have these attachments to what you've written or researched, and then you kind of I felt a little more passive when it came to actually presenting it, because I was like already had my fingerprints all over it.
Yeah.
But when I was actually less involved in the development of that content, and I realized that my client wanted me to kind of perform as a good designer, make it interesting visually, then it was sort of like, oh, this is great. So I actually felt liberated by a lot of the work I was doing with in dance and performance, because it wasn't my discourse, it wasn't my business, and I was coming to it in an almost purely formal way.
Right. That perfectly leads in. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of present day, and I didn't want to only talk about kind of the work that you had done 20 years ago.
That's great to hear.
But something that was interesting to me, and I have a couple kind of questions around this, but you're kind of, this is such a oversimplified statement, but your kind of public persona as a designer now, for lack of a better term, is you don't do much writing or speaking and that kind of discourse, and you're very much a designer.
Right.
And I'm curious, was that a conscious decision? Was it kind of just a natural evolution?
I think that I have become so immersed in being a designer and have felt a little bit estranged from kind of the theory and writing aspect. I kind of want to get back to it. I'm teaching a class at Cooper in the fall, and I'm really curious to like re-enter that kind of framing a lot of ideas that are sort of I take for granted now. They're part of the way I think.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of looking forward to externalizing it with a new audience, new generation. And I do want to return to more writing, but it's not as though it's sort of like a totally conscious staying away from it, but I find that a lot of the issues, a lot of the concerns are just, I feel like really technology is really swept aside. A lot of what made that early work really vital, a lot of the discourse has just become really organized around technology, and it doesn't interest me much.
Do the discourses from then, do they still still influence the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, I don't know if people see it within the work, but I feel like you would ask, like, how did being a designer and a writer and sometimes a researcher, how does that influence what I do? I feel like the work that I do, especially with curators on exhibitions, is very much informed by the role of having been a curator on many projects that I've done. So I think that it's more just understanding the capacity and the sort of role of the writer or the curator that is, sort of making me a better partner to the people that I work with. So a lot of the things that I've done that are, I feel like fully invested in the projects that I've done as a designer, not really feeling like, God, if only I could get back to writing.
Right.
I do, I would love to work on a project about exhibition design that I see is a book.
Yeah.
But I'm not pining to, like, publish again. I think I will.
Yeah.
But it's really taken a back seat to actually just doing work that I find interesting.
Yeah. You had started answering this already, but I'm kind of curious how, you had mentioned that so much of the discourse now is about technology. Yeah. I was curious kind of what other, as somebody who has kind of participated in the design discourse in a lot of different kind of capacities, how has that changed over your career? What are things that are kind of happening now, that designers are kind of talking about that, you wouldn't have imagined?
I don't know that it's that dramatic. I think that what I think is kind of interesting is that a lot of the early kind of positions in design really revolved around sort of aesthetic positions, which is really interestingly no longer. It's almost quaint, these idea of kind of like even the sort of style issues that animated a lot of those discussions, and the idea of kind of like East Coast versus West Coast, those are all dissolved.
Yeah, you're right, actually.
And so it kind of, I think that the broader cultural issues have kind of swept aside a lot of what made those debates like very local to graphic design.
Yeah.
And so we all live in a kind of a media environment now that's sort of much more shared. Like our graphic design debates were incredibly narrow when I was younger and when there were such debates. Now I think, what Ellen is doing with her exhibition on sort of multi-sensory design, I think there is this kind of desire to kind of go to other levels beyond sort of the way things look or even, interface design, to really think about this sort of multi-sensory person, this multi-sensory receiver. And I love all that because my work in exhibition design has really been about a kind of bigger framework for the designer to work within.
Yeah. I mean, and it's something that has come up again and again in these other interviews that I've done in kind of how it's changed is that, when you were having these discussions, when you were in school and you're talking about it being very narrow, and now a company can kind of redesign their logo and there'll be a story about it in, the New York Times or Fast Company.
Fast Company, right.
Does that change? Does the fact that there's now a kind of general audience awareness of graphic design and of work that you're doing, does that change how you think about your work at all?
I think it changes the way clients think about the work that the work they may be undertaking. I'm doing a project now that's for a very, very big organization.
Okay.
And I think that it's been fascinating to kind of work through the sort of expectations of basically social media and public perceptions around changing a sort of an existing identity. And so I think that you know, the phenomenon of the Gap redesign or whatever recent design crisis, identity crisis has happened, has instilled a greater wariness on the part of clients, of companies. But I think that it's actually a good sign. I think this kind of accountability and sensitivity and awareness of the validity of design, that design does matter, is actually a good thing.
Yeah.
The kind of sophistication and literacy that has emerged around graphic design seems to me really positive.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, you can have your problems with the way people respond instantly to a redesign or a new logo, but actually it's sort of an amazing thing that people give a shit.
Yeah, exactly. What are things or subjects that, this is a question that I've asked everyone that I've talked to, what are the things that designers should be talking about today? Or, you know, what are the kind of critical, what are the things that designers should kind of turn their criticism towards right now?
You know, I'd love to hear your interpretation of what design criticism is, because I really do find that that's sort of a mystery topic.
Yeah.
Where do you see it happening?
Yeah, I mean, that's you're the first person to ask me that, actually. And I feel like my own definition of this has evolved over the last year and a half now, and I'm even hesitant to even use the word criticism now. And the thing that I've kind of arrived at is, and this is why I asked you the question, because you started talking about it already, is that graphic design influences so much of the world, and that's kind of what design criticism should be talking about, and should be looking at not just the formal aspects of it, not just the you know, company X redesigned their logo, let's do a before and after and talk about, you know, the kerning and or the color choices, but kind of the whole system around which these things are created and how they're put into the world. And so it's, you know, why did the company redesign their logo? What does this mean? How is it being received? And that it's kind of for designers. You know, I think it's something for the profession to be kind of talking about and thinking about. In that we can't, I'm about to make a couple of very kind of broad statements that I don't know if I can fully defend, but that we kind of can't always be looking at design history to tell us how to do things today. And so as much as I love, you know, Paul Rand and all of his logos, we should be questioning, is that way of designing a logo still what makes a good logo today? And kind of constantly redefining our processes and the work that we do and how it's kind of functioning in this world. And so that discourse is kind of how I would, or the types of design criticism that I would like to see.
And I mean, that sounds like something that you might, if it had a place, you might find it in at one end of the spectrum, and design issues at another end of the spectrum, or Harvard Business Review, you know, in another. So I think that the what I think would be interesting is if design criticism actually made it a little more into a mainstream territory. And I think it happens sometimes with fashion and architecture. And I think that's super exciting to me when people are talking about design in these forums. I think what you're describing is a little more inside baseball, but I think it's possible.
Yeah.
Just as you can read an incredible architectural review, you can imagine that people can handle it. They can actually go through the launch of a new brand and talk about it in a way that was actually journalistic and kind of insightful and all of those things that you expect of awesome journalism about architecture. So I think that a magazine that I'm obsessed with is Architectural Review in London. And that's like what I want from out of my dream for a kind of good discourse in graphic design would be Architectural Review for graphic design. Because it just pumps out amazing stuff that is both reviews of current practice and architectural theory, urbanism. It's amazing. And it's like, I don't know if it's monthly or every other month, but I'm always astonished by how good it is. Issue after issue.
I feel like architecture has definitely mastered is a strong word, but definitely have figured out the discourse around what they do, both for the profession, but then also for a general audience. I think that's a great example. And that's why I thought it was so interesting that architecture back when you were in school is kind of what attracted you. I always think of Herbert Muchamp writing in the New York Times about architecture for a general audience, very specifically, very literary, funny, very accessible, but also was really dealing with a lot of
I think that's sort of what is the exciting part, is that people don't realize that they're actually kind of engaged with design criticism because they're actually just fascinated to be reading this guy's text about a giant building that just went up. And I mean, a lot of that interplay of being able to kind of tuck these critical insights into the review, someone wants to know about this building. Along the way, they're getting a really rich kind of channel of information that's about sort of the ideas behind it. And I feel like we don't often get that level of analysis about artifacts of graphic design or even exhibition design. I've been doing exhibition design for almost my whole career, and rarely is the design of an exhibition even commented on. And it's sort of frustrating to me because it's one of the ways that both institutions and curators voice their perspective on the material. And yet it goes, apart from a little like lovely design or something, there's very little that looks at the way the work is presented as part of the sort of editorial or curatorial perspective.
That was, I mean, I have two more questions, but that was something that I was interested in talking to you about, just kind of briefly about your work itself being a type of critical activity, or your work itself being a type of authorship, and that you don't need to kind of take your design theories and put those into a text, but you can actually manifest themselves in your work. Is that something that you are kind of thinking about? And when you are designing an exhibition, how much of your kind of view on the things that are being shown do you think are coming up in your design work?
I think the curators that I've worked with are very interested in what I bring to a project, and just as I'm interested in what they're working on. And I think that idea of the kind of reciprocity is really key. And I'm talking about a curator named Donald Albrecht, a curator named Eileen Gallagher, curator named Maurice Berger. These are all people that I've worked with, and it's sort of this incredible dialogue that you develop and a kind of a shorthand. And these are people who actually anticipate that design can actually help make the argument, make sense of the materials, even when they're articulated well, the idea that the hierarchy that exhibition design brings to content is really amazing. That it's a kind of it's another way of writing, and I think that that's what's been common to my experiences, both for myself in designing exhibitions that I've curated, but also kind of being in the designer's seat, working with someone who's already developed ideas. And I think that that's, if I had to point to something I think is a unique territory for myself, it is exhibition design, because of that almost broader sensory environment, bigger, like working in a physical space, having a dialogue with architecture and space and people's experience, sound, motion, it's sort of all there in a way that if you compare that experience to designing a book is so single channel, single scale, that it makes exhibitions, obviously much more exciting.
I mean, I didn't even make this connection until right now, but it brings in your interest in sculpture. I think there's certain kind of filmic qualities to an exhibition that you had mentioned. You were interested in film theory, and then playing with space and kind of authorship. It all is in exhibition design, actually.
Yeah, and it's really an interesting medium to me because of that. And I also, have such a love of architecture that it's almost the graphic designer's version is exhibition design. And, I also love that it's temporary, and I mean, I love the fact that the books that we design are still around, but there's something intriguing about the ephemeral nature of exhibition design. And, if you go back to the avant-gardes, I think some of the most exciting work that was done was about exhibitions. And, they're tropes that we still work with and use. And really, Herbert Bayer really thought of exhibition design as sort of the cousin to advertising because it was persuasive. And what made it persuasive was that it was environmental. So this idea of kind of the sort of immersive spaces that exhort people, it's very weirdly connected to kind of propaganda because of that same modernist history. But it's really fascinating to me that it's sort of the Gesamtkunstwerk for graphic designers,
That's interesting. My last question is completely different. And it's a two-part question, and I think it's fairly simple and straightforward. I had found, as I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about and was researching and reading a lot of things that you had written and interviews you had done, I'd found a list of books that you would recommend, and it was Derrida and Foucault and Barth and Rosalind Krauss. And so a two-part question. One, I'm interested in kind of who are the writers or the books that have influenced your own design thinking the most? And then the second part is, who are the writers or books that you recommend the most to other designers or people who are kind of interested in these same ways of thinking?
I think, I don't know if he was in my list originally, but the book that really opened my eyes to like an expanded sense of design, both criticism and history, was Adrian Forty, who wrote a book called Objects of Desire. And
I've heard of this.
It's an amazing book for kind of, in a funny way, folding in social and cultural issues into design so fully that it almost is like, it's not a straight up like history of design. It's actually all these other factors that influenced, for example, hygiene and the role of hygiene in the development of products, households, cleaning products.
Interesting.
And it was very influential for us because Ellen and myself, when we did the history of the kitchen and bathroom.
Oh, yeah.
Which was very much, inspired by the work of Adrian Forty, but kind of focusing on the American context as opposed to the British.
Okay.
So Adrian Forty's book, to me, remains like a really amazing benchmark. Penny Spark was a design historian British design historian also, who was a big inspiration for work in a very similar vein.
Yeah.
But now, when I think about books that are, Rosalind Krauss is very special to both me and Ellen. We did many courses with Rosalind Krauss at City University.
Okay.
She's a true mentor, and kind of interesting to us both for the work that she had done on surrealism and photography, but also incredible. Her book, The Optical Unconscious, is brilliant. The work that she did on minimalist sculpture is equally amazing. And she was an example of a kind of critic who was almost, the work was really approaches art. Her writing about art is, for me, art. And sort of goes, although not in a self-conscious way, but absolutely mesmerizing, brilliant work. So the other people that I wanted to mention, just in terms of who I think are really interesting, and in a funny way, it's not literary in any way, is Bernard Rudofsky, who is a sort of fascinating designer who worked in many different disciplines across his whole career. He designed exhibitions, he designed books, he designed clothing, he designed footwear, but he also curated a ton of exhibitions, some at the Museum of Modern Art. But he was kind of like a interesting freelance intellectual, engaged with design.
Yeah.
To me, he's such a
never heard of this person.
He's such a great role model for designers now, just because it was this kind of, he's a polymath who actually just went where his mind took him.
Yeah.
And did brilliant work all across those fields. An incredible international career as well. So there's a couple books by him and a couple books about him, but he's absolutely a fascinating kind of, I wouldn't even call him a Renaissance man, just because it's not like you just have to look him up.
I always get mad when someone gives a name and it sounds this interesting, and I've never heard of this person before.
He's not well remembered, but he's incredible. Yeah. Books, exhibitions, product design, architecture, totally amazing guy. And then Bruno Munari.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Who I think everybody has a really strong awareness of. But I find that kind of condensation of poetry and almost, it's pure poetry to me. Yeah. And it has this way of being a meta commentary on design. Yeah. Those are kind of some heroes of mine. Yeah. Apart from people I, really directly studied with incredible people throughout my career.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was so fun. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for talking to me. This episode was recorded on April 30th, 2017 in Baltimore, Maryland. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.